Welcome back. We now come to part 4 of our discussion of upper motor neuronal systems for motor control. And we come to a topic that has always intrigued me, and I've always found it very much fun to explore and to talk about. It's a discussion of what might be considered to be an emotional motor system. So my learning objective for you is to simply discuss the evidence that there actually exists an emotional motor system within our body's systems for governing movement. Well, I'm going to suggest again to you that one principal theme for motor control is that there are parallel pathways by which upper motor neurons can govern the activities of lower motor neurons. Now, we've spent a good bit of our time so far talking about what is depicted here on the left-hand side of this figure. That is a set of pathways that come from upper motor neurons in the motor cortex and in the brainstem that are concerned with the expression of skilled behavior, and this would involve the lateral pathways that come from the motor cortex to the lateral part of the ventral horn, being concerned with the fine control of the distal extremities. And then, in order to facilitate the expression of skill, there are pathways that come from the brainstem primarily that are concerned with adjusting posture and setting the stage for the expression of that skill. And this involves making adjustments to the gain of our segmental reflexes. And so these brainstem systems send projections to lower motor neurons. There's in particular a role for the reticular formation of the brainstem in adjusting the gain of these pools of lower motor neurons. Now, what I'd like to turn to is the concept that in parallel, there are projections from other parts of the forebrain, other regions that give rise to connections primarily to the reticular formation of the brainstem, but perhaps also directly to pools of lower motor neurons in the brainstem and the spinal cord. And these regions of the forebrain that I have in mind are not in the posterior frontal lobe. So we don't conventionally consider them to be part of what is sometimes called the pyramidal motor system. That is, the parts of the motor cortex that give rise to the cortical spinal pathway that can be found in the medullary pyramid. For this reason, we call these extrapyramidal projections. And these extrapyramidal projections are coming from limbic centers in the ventral and medial parts of the forebrain, including some structures in the medial part of the temporal lobe, such as the amygdala, and parts of the ventral part of the forebrain, such as the hypothalamus and the diencephalon. So these so-called limbic centers then give rise to projections that run in parallel to those that are emanating from the posterior part of the frontal lobe and the upper motor neurons of the brainstem. So these pathways are largely involved in the expression of non-volitional behavior that we associate with emotion. These pathways are also those that are engaging our bodily systems, both our somatic motor systems and our visceral motor systems, for emergency situations that might require fight or flight. In order to try to be somewhat consistent with our lateral and medial scheme that we talked about for the control of volitional movement, we can likewise recognize a lateral and a medial scheme for the organization of these parallel descending projections in this emotional motor system. The lateral system is involved in expressing specific emotional behaviors, particular gestures of our facial region, for example, that communicate particular emotion, or particular postures that are involved in nonverbal communication. These tend to run through pathways that can be found in a more lateral region of the tegmentum of the brainstem. There are more medial pathways that are concerned with setting the stage, and these pathways are adjusting gain of reflexes, perhaps making it more or less likely that we might express a particular emotional behavior in our facial muscles. So let me give you an example of this emotional motor system in action. So I'm going to use some now quite old pictures of my son, who is now in his adolescent years. But in his younger years, it was very instructive for me to think about the operation of a pyramidal motor system for volitional control, and the operation of an emotional motor system, which moved the muscles of the face and our posture in a way that conveyed true emotional significance. Well, let me show you a picture of my son when he was about 18 months old. So typically when we would approach him, his name is Jonathan, and we would try to get him to smile. We'd say, smile for the camera, Jonathan. This is what we would get. Something that we sometimes call around here a cheesy smile, because sometimes people say cheese in front of a camera to try to create sort of a false impression of an actual emotional smile, when in fact it is a volitional motor act. And so this is what my son is doing here. So we're trying to get him to smile, and you can see that he is constricting his orbicularis oculi. He's trying to show his teeth here, and so in his 18-month-old mind, he is doing what we want him to do. He's expressing an emotion. But as parents, we know, well, this isn't really what we wanted to photograph. We wanted to really capture him expressing a true emotion. Well, if you knew my son, you'd know that he was a rather stoic young man and seldom truly expressed his emotion. This was a different setting where we put him up in a studio to get his picture taken, and the photographer is waving a stuffed animal in front of him, trying to entertain him, get him to smile. And so what we see here is about as close to a happy expression as we ever saw in our 18-month-old son. And contrast that to this very forced facial expression. It's quite easy to tell the difference between which expression came from a force of will and which perhaps reflects a true experience of emotion. So why do you think we're so good at telling the difference between a genuine emotional smile and a forced smile? Well, I think partly the answer is that we understand, whether we articulate in these terms or not, that there are different neural centers in the forebrain that are organizing the expressions in the human face that are conveying genuine emotion or a contrived volitional motor act that is meant to imitate that emotion. Well, the genuine emotion that we might experience and express in the muscles of our face is motivated primarily by the medial divisions of the premotor cortex that run into the banks of the cingulate sulcus. In fact, there's a region right in about this region of the human brain called the cingulate motor area. And this region is active when we express an emotional smile. However, if we present a cheesy smile, a pyramidal smile to a camera, that smile is being organized and executed by motor circuits in the lateral and inferior part of the premotor and primary motor cortex. This is a pathway that runs along the cortico-bulbar path in parallel with the cortical spinal fiber. So we consider this to be part of our pyramidal motor system. So quite different regions of the forebrain are responsible for the emotional smile and what we sometimes call the pyramidal smile. Now, if you view the tutorial that I've prepared to discuss the control of facial expression by upper motor neurons, you'll realize that there's also an important clinical sign that can be associated with the connection between these two different parts of the premotor cortex and the lower motor circuits of the facial motor nucleus. So please take some time and review that tutorial, because testing of facial motor performance is a key part of the neurological exam. I'd like to give you one more example of how our volitional motor systems and our emotional motor systems are integrated and coordinated to produce a desired motor output. In this case, the example is human speech. Now, my speech isn't particularly emotional at the moment. I suppose it could be, but you sort of know what you're getting from me at this point in the course. But nevertheless, we can break down speech into different components, right? So there is the pure active vocalization, that is just producing the sound itself, so that requires some coordination of motor output. And then there is, of course, what we're interested in, and that is the semantic content of speech that comes with the production of the phonemes that are representing the vowels and the syllables and the structure of the vocalization that conveys the semantic content. So it's necessary to integrate these two components of speech in order to actually produce understandable human language. So how does this happen? So these different aspects of speech are coordinated by motor output from the brainstem. So for example, one needs to coordinate the movements of the mouth, mouth opening, contractions of the floor of the mouth, the movements of the tongue, movements of the pharynx and the larynx, in order to coordinate that vocal motor apparatus for the production of the speech sounds that are necessary for intelligible language. But there's also coordination of respiratory rhythms and the muscles that force air through the larynx. So there's additional musculature that must be coordinated with the vocal motor apparatus found in the oral pharynx and in the larynx. And so this all occurs through the activity of lower motor circuits. And these motor circuits involve the nucleus ambiguus, the facial nucleus, the trigeminal motor nucleus, the hypoglossal nucleus, and the dorsal motor nucleus of vagus. So already you can understand the complexity of motor output that is required to make human speech. Well, when we back up now and consider how do upper motor neurons govern these lower motor neurons, we learn a little bit about the organization of parallel pathways. So concerning the semantic content of speech, this information is processed in our lateral premotor cortex in that very special part that we call Broca's area that is especially concerned with expressing human speech. Well, Broca's area, being part of our premotor cortex, sends projections to these lower motor neurons. It also sends connections through our primary motor cortex that interact with these lower motor circuits, and this helps give some structure to the vocal articulation of speech. But these signals would not be sufficient in and of themselves to produce speech. In addition to those projections that are emanating from the lateral part of the premotor cortex, we also need to engage our medial premotor regions, as well as structures including the amygdala and the hypothalamus that are going to be important for imbuing speech with emotion. And so there are relays from these ventral and medial regions of the forebrain to structures in the brainstem, including cell groups that are part of this periaqueductal gray region of the midbrain. And in turn, the periaqueductal gray sends connections to the reticular formation, especially parts of the medullary reticular formation, that then interact with our lower motor circuits. So the coordination of these two limbs is what is necessary to produce human speech. So of course, ultimately that coordination is derived from executive centers in the prefrontal cortex. Well, I think speech is perhaps a surprising example of convergence of parallel motor commands from very different parts of the brain that are responsible for creating the complete expression of human speech that has semantic content. We can think of that as a skilled articulation of our vocal motor apparatus, but also has the necessary gain, that has the necessary tone, and has structure that we interpret as emotion. And these signals are modulated by very different parts of the premotor cortex and even regions of the brain that are outside of our conventional collection of centers that we call the motor system. I'm thinking now of the hypothalamus and the amygdala that contribute to the expression of emotion in human speech. Okay, we've finally come to the final part of this rather lengthy tutorial on upper motor neurons, and what I'd like to talk about next in our final segment is the clinical picture that we would discover in an individual who has suffered injury or disease that affected upper motor neurons.